What's up guys, it's Zero here. Today we're talking about Final Fantasy and the continuation of this iconic franchise. So let's get into it. So guys, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy 17. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about this up and coming title, like the release date, what, this game is all going to encompass. And I wanted to certainly talk about this with all of you guys. As someone who's not super well versed in the Final Fantasy universe, I wanted to talk about this though, because obviously as Final Fantasy has gone along over the years, this has become such a massive franchise for Square Enix, and I'm really excited to, dive more and more into the Final Fantasy games as they've done remakes and things of that nature. I've certainly become, more familiarized with the franchise. So in an article coming to us from Echo Apsy of Inverse, you may have heard a story about the origins of Final Fantasy. It typically goes that the game developer, then called Square, was on the brink of bankruptcy. So it put all its hopes in one final game, which is why the long-running series is called Final Fantasy. It turns out the story is totally fake. Square actually wanted to call the game Fighting Fantasy, but had to pivot at the last minute due to a trademark issue. Really, really interesting. Fast forward 37 years, and Final Fantasy is still going strong with its developer, now Square Enix, currently working on two major games in the series, a third entry in its acclaimed remake of Final Fantasy VII, and the next installment in the mainline franchise, Final Fantasy 17. So, guys, I think that obviously with the remakes that they're doing over at Square Enix for Final Fantasy, they want to continue to build this franchise for the next generation, because a lot of times, and I know myself included, when Final Fantasy, first came out, they've made so many of these titles at this point, and for someone who isn't super familiar with Final Fantasy, diving into Final Fantasy 16, 15, whatever it might be, a lot of times I think that deters people away from the franchise just because of how many games they've made at this point in time. And so, I think them doing these remakes is really a smart strategic, decision, because it gets people to at least try it, to see what they're like, even though they're remakes. Getting people to try Final Fantasy out and then obviously get them hooked on the series for the long-withstanding future. And so the first big thing is there going to be a Final Fantasy 17? Well, Square Enix technically hasn't confirmed that the next mainline Final Fantasy game is in development yet, but it's likely only a matter of time before it does. Then again, considering how long we may have to wait for the game's release, it makes sense to hold off on any official announcements. So the gaps between the entries in the franchise have become longer and longer. The time between Final Fantasy 15 and 16 was almost 7 years. Final Fantasy 16 released in 2023, so going by that pattern, the next entry may not arrive until 2030. It's also worth noting that Square Enix's current priority is the final part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, which we're expecting to see in roughly 2028. In other words, it's going to be a long wait for Final Fantasy XVII's release date. And so I really hope, guys, that we don't have to wait until 2030 for Final Fantasy 17. I hope that, they work on, obviously, the remakes that they want to get done, and, we don't have to wait until 2028 for Final Fantasy's VII Remake trilogy to be completed. I'm hoping it doesn't take quite that long. That way that they can start working on Final Fantasy 17, a lot sooner. And so, what platforms will Final Fantasy 17 be on? Well, this is interesting, guys, because obviously it's a number of years away at this point in time. Recent Final Fantasy games have launched as PlayStation exclusives, but Square Enix is rethinking this strategy after both Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth sold below expectations. Therefore, Final Fantasy 17 will most likely be released simultaneously across the PlayStation, Xbox, and PC to grab the biggest audience possible. I think that this makes complete sense, at least to me. I think releasing it on all the consoles or as many consoles as they possibly can is going to be really helpful to build the player base of Final Fantasy. We won't know for sure until Square Enix is willing to divulge details on the next game, but it is unlikely Square Enix will take another risk on a console exclusive after failing to see the rewards from those decisions in recent years. As for which console specifically, that's harder to predict. Rumor has it the next generation of gaming hardware from PlayStation Xbox could arrive as soon as 2028, so it's possible Final Fantasy XVI could launch on PS6 and whatever the next Xbox is called, though it will probably be available for PS5 and Xbox Series XS devices too. Obviously, I believe, guys, there's a lot of rumors and speculation that PlayStation and Xbox won't make any more consoles. I completely disagree with this. I believe the cash cow that is these consoles, they will continue to make these as long as they are, profitable for the companies, that being Sony and Microsoft respectively. So I think that it's reasonable to expect that the next Final Fantasy will absolutely be on, it should be on PlayStation as well as Xbox. I think of games like Halo, Gears of War that are Xbox exclusives, and there's a lot of talk that these games may be broadening their horizons to, putting those on PlayStation to widen the player base. Because obviously, if you just release it on one console, a lot of times it's not going to do as well as it would if it was on multiple platforms. Yes, Gears of War or Halo, for example, are going to, get people to buy the Xboxes just because of, them being console exclusives. And same goes for PlayStation with games like The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, God of War, and things of that nature. But I think that this, console exclusivity is going to change over the course of time just because when you release it on multiple platforms, it gives it a much better chance at being way more successful than if you just had a console exclusive. So we'll see what happens in the future with that. Well, is Final Fantasy XVII going to feature turn-based combat? Well, Square Enix hasn't revealed anything about the next Final Fantasy's game combat, but it's safe to say that this won't be a turn-based adventure. While the franchise got its start with that kind of gameplay, it's been over 20 years since we got a mainline turn-based Final Fantasy game. Even the FF7 remakes ditched turn-based combat. And so, in terms of the story, guys, this is all speculation, but it's hard to gauge what the setting or story for Final Fantasy XVII could be prior to release. The Game of Thrones style fantasy setting of Final Fantasy XVI took a lot of people by surprise upon its initial reveal, but with the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth trilogy's modern architecture and landscapes, we would guess that Final Fantasy XVII may shift towards a high sci-fi aesthetic for its next story. The closest parallel is Final Fantasy XIII. This could help differentiate the entry, and we wouldn't be surprised if a more drastic setting or gameplay twist is also added to help freshen up the franchise and put a new spin on its RPG formula. So, in terms of the story, guys, like I said, and like they're mentioning in the article, it's really hard to gauge what direction Square Enix is going to go in. I would have to assume that they're going to go with what's working for them right now. Not what maybe worked for them way back in the day, but what's working for them right now. Is it that turn-based style? Is the story, the setting, is it going to be better for a Game of Thrones style video game, or are they going to kind of change those things? It's really hard to say, but I think they're going to go with what's working best for them right now in the current gaming landscape. And so I would say that with how, the Final Fantasy VII remake as well as Final Fantasy XVI, how those were, when those were released, obviously it didn't sell as well as they were hoping, that being Square Enix. So I would say that they are certainly going to gauge the story and all of those things based on what did work and what didn't work, and that way they can kind of gauge those things, and that's why they're going to really take their time. And at the end of the day, guys, I'm down with Square Enix really taking their time with Final Fantasy XVII. I want them to take their time, make sure that the game is well polished, that they're making the right business decisions as well as the right creative, changes or similarities to this upcoming title to make it the biggest Final Fantasy we've ever had. Because we know, guys, that games like this, an RPG style like Final Fantasy, if it does well, this upcoming title, that being Final Fantasy XVII, we're going to get more and more Final Fantasy, continuations. And this could also really just help the RPG genre as a whole because of how long the Final Fantasy games have been going on. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts about this in the comment section down below. What are your guys' thoughts about Final Fantasy 17? When do you think it's going to release? What are you hoping that they do in the future with this title? And I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. And let's have a real conversation about it, guys. Let me know what you guys think, and for more Final Fantasy 17 content and videos, keep it right here.